Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I would like to share with you a little bit of South African story today and yes, show you a little bit of a different side of the world. Although I must say, there are many similarities to the talk on Rio that we've heard this morning. Okay, just a little bit about the South African context quickly. There are very high levels of unemployment, inequality, insecurity, and crime. I'm not going to go into detail into that. And as a result of this, there are various responses to crime and insecurity. And these responses also happen in the built environment. So you've heard about a range of target hardening measures, burglar bars on windows, fences around properties, and even on a large scale, the so-called gated communities, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But as a result, there's a number of questions that emerge. Are these a new type of utopia, or is it just a realistic response to crime? And what are the implications for social order and spatial integration? And finally, where I wish to go this afternoon is what is the implications for urban sustainability? Some of the writers have said that there's a clear link between urban security and sustainability, and that a city cannot be sustainable if there is crime and fear of crime, and we've heard a lot about the fear of crime this afternoon. And also that a city is not sustainable if citizens fear crime and if the safety of their livelihoods are in jeopardy. And it's also been said that urban safety is one of the key challenges for sustainable development in the beginning of the 21st century. And this is definitely also the case in South Africa. So if we then have to start looking at crime and its impact on urban sustainability, how should we go about doing this? We see that if we need to study crime, crime is a key driver influencing sustainability of human settlements in South Africa, but we also have to look a little bit broader at all the forces of transformation, that there are a number of different pressures on settlements. These pressures influence the state of the environment, and this in turn have a number of implications or impacts on a socio-spatial level. But very importantly, these implications are not linear. There's not a linear cause and effect relationship. It's a very systemic relationship. For example, the response to crime in the form of target hardening can cause escalation in violent crime, and this can cause fear of crime, and then the exclusion, social exclusion, spatial exclusion that goes with that, and this can in turn affect the poverty levels again, which was part of the problem right from the start, again, one of the original drivers of crime. So we see there's a lot of knock-on effects and unintended consequences that we have to consider as well. So we cannot consider urban security in isolation. We have to also then look at its impact on urban sustainability and in a more complex way, and how it relates to other things. In this sense, what are the drivers of crime, for example, poverty or unemployment, and how these drivers have a specific influence on the pressures, and what is the impact of that, for example, on social order, spatial integration, and democratic government. So there's a need for an integrated framework to analyze and understand these different relationships. And I'm going to use such an environment to tell you a little bit about the South African story this afternoon. This so-called DIPSA model was developed by the OECD, originally to measure the sustainability of human settlements, but it's also very useful to look at the impact of crime on urban sustainability. So in terms of the drivers, you would look at the human activities, the processes and the patterns, and the external influences. And then look at what's the impact of that, the pressures of human activities on the environment and the socioeconomic development. What is the impact of that? How does that then in turn influence the current condition of human settlements? And then the impact of human health and environmental consequences of the state, that should be state of human settlements. And then finally, the policy and other responses to the state of this human settlement. So how do people then respond? How do they then react to these different problems? And that's what I would like to go through each one in turn. So if we look at the drivers of crime, why such high crime levels in South Africa? Now, lots have been written about that, and I'm not going to even try to share all of that with you, but just to give you a brief overview. although there's been a decline of crime since for some time now, the crime started to rise again as it was appeared in the latest when the latest crime statistics was released. And especially things like aggravated robbery was on the increase. And some of the largest concerns at this stage relate to the so-called trio crimes: house robberies, business robberies, and car hijackings that went up significantly in South Africa. The first two increased in all 9 provinces, while the last 3 increased in 7 provinces. So if you look at this graph, you see that since 2002, 2003, there's been a slight decrease in all types of crimes, violent interpersonal, robbery, property crimes, and other. And then from last year till the 07 and 08 to 08, 09, there's been an increase again, and that's what many people are worried again, and they're wondering if this shows a trend that it will go up again in South Africa as well. Just the other thing that I would like to point out, look at the big proportion of the crime that are violent interpersonal crimes in South Africa, and that's where the big challenge lie. It's not so much the numbers, but it's actually that a large proportion of the crime are interpersonal violent crimes. And then if we look at the so-called trio crimes, we also see how the car hijackings, the business robberies, and the house robberies have increased. And to get back to the whole debate we've had this afternoon on the fear of crime, these are the type of crimes that really, they've showed, have got a big impact on the increase of the fear of crime among people. Okay, and as we've also heard during this conference quite a lot, crime effects and the distribution vary, and this is also the case in South Africa. It does not affect all people uniformly. Being victimized or influenced by age, income, the place of residence or work, and the circle of friends that people have. So it's also linked to the distribution of crime, and therefore it differs between municipalities and within cities. So this is just a map that you can see here of all the municipalities, the municipal areas in South Africa in all 9 of the provinces. And you can see the intensity of crime differs between the different municipalities. The ones that are dark brown are the ones with the highest rates of crime. These are ones particularly for property crimes. And this is the same kind of analysis that you can see on a municipal level. This is for the municipal area of Johannesburg, and you can see the highest crime rates, violent crime rates, are actually right in the central region of the city of Johannesburg. And if we look at the municipality, the city of Tshwane, which is around Pretoria, as you all know that. You can also see in terms of violent crimes, the areas with the highest intensity is the central region, number 8, and then also one of the areas to the east, which is sort of a lower income area to that side. And then if you look at the property crime rate, it's much more linked to the it's also very linked to the income of the areas. It's a central area again, but number 7 and number 4 as well is also quite wealthier areas in this Tshwane area. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the distribution of crime. There's a number of reasons why crime are happening. A lot of you have asked me, so why do you have so much crime in South Africa? According to the literature and to the people that have looked into this in more detail, these are the aspects that contribute to the crime rates in South Africa. The high levels of poverty and inequality, culture of violence, right through the struggle and the transition period from authoritarian rule to democracy. There's been a huge culture of violence that was embedded in people, and this has just gone on. There's a very youthful population, and also things that I've mentioned before, like a single one person heading a family, or some families due to AIDS, that you get AIDS orphans that don't have parents, or just women-headed households and things like that, that also adds to that. The whole issue around political transition, and I will get back to that, rapid urbanization, the proliferation of firearms, a huge increase in organized crime, and then also the spatial patterns of the apartheid city, which I'd like to focus a little bit on. And some of these spatial characteristics that contributes to crime are the dislocation of the poor on the peripheries, which we have a huge problem with, the separation of communities through buffer strips and undeveloped open land, the rigid monofunctional zoning that's still in place, degraded and poorly developed environments, and a lack of recreational facilities. So we would get to come back to your presentation on the places where people have to wait, typically in township areas. This is a taxi rank, and if you have to walk here in the dark and you have to stand and wait there, you can see think for yourself the opportunities for crime happening at this particular spot. Or if you have to walk to the transport location and you have to walk through an area like this, no opportunities for surveillance, overgrown vegetation, ample opportunities, and this is typically where the rapes occur. Or monofunctional areas, dormitory areas. This is the typical RDP, housing developments for the really low income households. Although they get a house, which is subsidized by government, there's no other facilities. And often the infrastructure is poor, and often it's on the periphery of cities, and people have to travel long distances to employment opportunities. And all of these create then opportunities for crime in turn. Or undeveloped public open spaces. This is in front of an old hostel building that used to house migrant workers, and now it is housing entire families in overcrowded conditions, and if it's not been refurbished yet, then it can cause a lot of problems together with the open spaces that are not maintained, no ownership, no sense of territoriality, and all of those principles that we've been speaking about. Or the so-called slum areas or informal settlements, which is South Africa's version of the favelas that we've heard about this morning. A lack of infrastructure, a lack of any other things like lighting, and often a lot of hiding places for people. So also where some of the crimes occur. Or on the other side, criminals have found it's very useful places to hide from the police. So once you disappear there, you can't find them again. So that's the other side of the story. Also informal settlements located along rivers. You can just look at the conditions. And that's also not just related to safety problems in terms of crime, but also related to safety problems in terms of health and so on as well. Okay, so the high levels of violent crime is also due to political history and the culture of violence. Many families in South Africa suffered from the so-called institutional violence right through the 80s and the middle of the 90s. Also, there was a lot of disruption of lives through forced removals, through migrant labor policies. And the result of all this has been that violence was becoming a means of solving conflict. And you'll see how this goes through right even to today, that people believe this is the only way in which we can solve problems. And then another contributor is, or another pressure is the whole issue of the transition to democracy. From authoritarian rule to a democracy, and we see many similar patterns to other countries, like Brazil, for example, or Argentina, that also went through these similar transitions. And many of the political science and criminologists have shown the relationship between political transition and the increased levels of crime due to social disruption that goes with that. And one of the responses of that, or one of the results of that, is growing defensive urbanism. Things like gated complexes, gated communities, and so on. On the more social side, it's also the emergence of vigilante groups, and then on the richer side, the emergence of private security for people to protect themselves, those who have the money to do that. And of course, the fear of crime itself becomes a pressure then. High levels of violent and property crimes lead to the increase of fear. And we've seen from statistics that there's been an increase of fear of crime between 1998 and 2003, and again between 2003 and 2007. Both these victim surveys have confirmed that. And interesting enough, people are the most afraid in areas where they live. So not in areas that they have to go and visit, but actually the areas in which they live. And few people indicated that they felt safe when walking in their neighborhoods at night. And that was across the spectrum, from poor to rich. So this has all contributed then to increased urban fortification, which is the impact that it has on the state of the human settlements in various forms. First of all, the so-called gated communities in South Africa. So these are areas that are physically closed off from their surroundings, either prohibiting or controlling access. It's areas where normal public places have been privatized, where their use is restricted. And it's not only residential areas, but it's also office parks or entire mixed communities that are increasingly closing off. So what we've seen in South Africa is a pattern of increased privatization of the public space, of public services, and of public and of security that's been privatized. So in terms of the national survey that was carried out in 2002, two major types have been identified. The so-called enclosed neighborhoods and the security villages. Enclosed neighborhoods are actually existing neighborhoods that have been closed off for the purpose of security, and security estates are purposefully built for that as a secure estate right from the start. So just some photographs to give you an idea what I'm talking about. This is an entrance to an enclosed neighborhood in Johannesburg, and the access is restricted through a boom. This is an enclosed neighborhood, and access is restricted through a gate over this, what still is a public road, so you can imagine the controversy. This is also still a public road, and a whole physical structure across that to restrict access into this area, which is locked. So in effect, that road cannot be used anymore, but it still remains a public road to which people constitutionally still have to have access. So you can imagine the controversies that surrounded this whole development. And then you get private developments with access control, mostly on greenfield sites on the urban periphery. This, however, because it's private developments, you can actually control the access into the area. So this is a bit different. And then you get, that's mostly for the upper income groups. For the middle income groups, there are secure townhouse complexes, which is a cluster housing of low to medium density with a whole range of housing types. And this can accommodate medium and high income groups. These complexes are fenced or walled off in the environment. It's got access control, and usually inside it's got different forms of common recreational areas or open spaces inside. Typical entry to one of these complexes, you can see the security entrance, the place where the security guards are, the booms to control the access into this area. Another more upper income one, and you can see how the whole aesthetics of security becomes important, the entrance gate, the whole image that it's sending out in the built environment. Or another one. A big one on the urban periphery with different smaller complexes inside. And people queuing up. Obviously, residents can just go in with their access cards, but anyone who wants to visit have to stop there, sign a whole register, give all your personal details. Usually they phone the people that you want to visit, ask if you can come in, and then if that's so, then you can go in. So it can often lead to a bit of traffic congestion as well. But interesting enough, and that's what many people don't realize, the gated complexes are not just for the wealthy and for the middle income groups. Increasingly in South Africa, this has also created a precedent. So we also now get gated affordable housing complexes. So fortification is also part of affordable housing complexes where you have low-rise blocks with a range of dwelling and tenure types within a walled environment and with access control as well. So this is a typical one from the inner city of Johannesburg in a place called Newtown, very close to the very beautiful Mandela Bridge, for those of you who have seen that before. And it's typically a courtyard building with access control to that. And this is the entry point, and you can see how big the security guard's house is. So it gives you an idea of this importance of security, and this is affordable housing. It's social housing in South Africa. They get subsidies from the Social Housing Institute. So you can see even in this context how important security is. So it's not just the wealthy that wants to protect themselves, it's everybody that's afraid of crime. And then the entry in there, residents have to have cards to get in there, and visitors then have to also sign in to get entry into this social housing complex. And this is the inside of it, with some play facilities and so on. And this is another example of affordable housing in the inner city. it's called car gardens. You can see the security gate and also the entrance for pedestrians and the security guardhouse. And this is the inside of that. Okay, but as I said, it's not just physical responses, it's also issues such as vigilantism and private security that's been part of that influenced the state. There's been an increase in vigilante groups, formally organized groups, but also community watch groups that later can become very violent. And this in themselves becomes a violent force can become a violent source within the community. There's also been a huge increase in private security guards, which is this stage of 4 billion security industry in South Africa, with almost 300,000 security guards, which is more than double the number of police force in South Africa. So it gives you an idea. So there's a whole new economic sector developing around crime, and this contributes to the GDP and the tax base. So again, this starts to raise moral dilemmas. It's good for the economy, but what does it do for social order, for justice, and for those kind of things? Examples again of the entrance into enclosed neighborhood, which is strictly controlled by private security guards, which still remains a public road. So actually they're not allowed to control access restriction. They're just allowed to monitor it, but they don't. They force people to sign into a register. This is all. What is the impact of all this? It's contributed to the fear of crime, and it's led to a lot of lifestyle changes. So people adapt their lifestyle, and very importantly, they start to avoid public spaces. And as a result of that, no one is taking ownership of these public spaces. They become degraded, and they typically become hotspots for criminal activity. So what we see there is the privatization of public space services and security. Again, example of that privatization of public space and privatizing the control of entry into this space. And this has also got an impact on the urban environment. So the urban fortification measures contribute, first of all, to spatial fragmentation between these different enclosed neighborhoods. They start to alter movement patterns because you can't go through these neighborhoods anymore because they're closed off. They obstruct emergency access, and there's been lots of complaints to public hearings in terms of how emergency vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks and so on couldn't get into the neighborhoods quick enough because the roads are closed, they are locked, and there's only one entry point. It's also very difficult for low-income workers. That often the public transport, the so-called taxis, just drop them off at the gate, and then they have to walk much further because they can't get access into the usual grid pattern of that neighborhood that is now being closed off. So it's now turned into a closed neighborhood with only one entrance point. It's also very difficult for urban maintenance. A lot of the local authorities' maintenance vehicles can't get access, and it can lead to an increase in air and noise pollution on the only roads that are still open. Because you can imagine now, if you close off these neighborhoods, it transfers the traffic to the only remaining open roads between these neighborhoods, which increases the traffic there, and it increases the noise pollution along these areas as well. So this has raised an interesting debate around the whole issue of crime displacement as well, but the professor has left, which reacted on that this morning, but a lot of people have raised that as well. And then there's, of course, the whole impact on seclusion, exclusion, and conflict. People inside that just want to do things for themselves. They exclude everybody from outside, and it also creates conflict between different communities. For example, if you're on a certain class road, then you're not allowed to close your roads. Class 3, 2, or 1, but if you on depending on the context, on a 3, 4, 5 road, which is a smaller residential road, you can apply for permission to close off your road. So that creates a lot of conflict between communities. It also creates conflict between communities inside if you get people that want to close and people that don't want to close. So yeah. And as we see, the result of that is a new social order that's been established through the spatial order that's been changed. So what you get, for example, this was the original urban, the pattern of the streets in that particular area, and after people have closed off, this is what happened. So it just gives you an idea of the spatial fragmentation and the impact on movement. You also get permanent closure of existing roads. And another impact on urban maintenance is the impact on the road infrastructure. For those engineers around here, roads get traditionally designed for a specific number of traffic. If you've got too much traffic, it cracks sooner than it was intended. If you've got too less traffic inside the neighborhood, it also cracks. So it's got a huge impact on the maintenance plans of local authorities as well. And people that cannot get access to public parks to maintain these, which are closed off inside these neighborhoods. And then the whole issue on constitutional rights, entry, controlled access into public roads and so on. This is the notice in front of one of these areas. And then you have to go through this whole security system to actually access a road which is still public, technically. Okay, and it also links to some vulnerability of the poor and many people that cannot afford any form of fortification. They are vulnerable to many types of crime. Violent crime contribute to the loss of household income, increased security costs. They don't have insurance for that. Worsened socioeconomic conditions, and in this way, it's got impacts on their sustainable livelihoods potential. And in that way, it contributes to the root causes of crime, which is poverty. So you can see how the cycle then starts to close again. We were talking about the unintended consequences this morning and the vicious cycles. So again, just an example of the poverty and the difficult conditions, and then it makes it worse even if they're exposed to crime. And then, of course, it also leads to increased segregation and violence. The fear, the trauma, the high stress levels and social exclusion leads to a more segregated and aggressive society, and violence becomes a way to express grievances. And we've seen this lately in the spate of xenophobic attacks against foreigners in the past 2 years that have happened more and more in South Africa. People would gang up against each other. Locals would say that foreign people from Zimbabwe, Mozambique and so on are taking away their jobs, and there would be huge violent protests driving people out of these areas. And the result of that is that there's a need for more police and more health facilities and more people to address the results of these traumas. So this is a typical informal, one of the informal settlements on the outskirts of Johannesburg. And then one particular day, residents ganged up against the foreign people. It resulted in a huge shootout between local residents and the police, and that was the end result. You can see the people being affected by the crime and the violence. And it also places pressures on local authorities in the sense that they have to now redesign and manage the built environment to reduce opportunities for crime. So for local crime prevention strategies to be effective, and there's therefore a need for capable institutional structures to address these, but there's still many obstacles to good governance at this moment, which is also part of the problems. And as a result of that, there's also been another way of increasing this way of conflict is the only way to solve a problem. If local councils fail to deliver, some communities respond through violent protests. And very recently, in an area called Mamelodi outside Pretoria in March, this was the case. All of the residents gang up, and again it led to a huge shootout between the police and the residents because it was a service delivery protest against the council who they said failed to serve them and didn't provide houses and services in time. And this, of course, then have an impact on democracy. The increased violence and the disregard of laws start to challenge democracy, and democracy is not automatically the end. So what some people are arguing is that democracy is not automatically the end to violence. It can actually contribute to more violence if the state is incapable to address the violence. So many communities mobilize against it. They then say, the police can't help us, the state can't help us, so we'll help ourselves. So they then foster separation through exclusive spatial zones and control, and they start to create separate publics with different benefits that just increase this social cohesion, social segregation, separation. And then there's the whole question of private security guards that are on a rise. To who are they actually accountable? And is there a danger of going too far with all the surveillance and increased security measures? And what about the whole issue around the Big Brother society? But we also have to look at the range of responses. There has been quite a lot of responses, believe it or not. It's just that the problem is a bit big. So these responses happened at various levels of government with a range of programs, a gun-free society, a lot of septet responses. The police also commissioned 2 manuals, one on for local municipalities and communities on how to develop your own crime prevention strategies, and also one on crime prevention through environmental design. And there you see the 2 manuals. But what I would like to argue is that you cannot look at these. So what you can see is that there are many things. There are lots of drivers, there's lots of pressures that have an impact on the state, and this have an impact. So we cannot look at them in isolation. We have to look at the multiple feedbacks and their influence on each other. So we see that there's a need for safety and security, and that, and that this is a major driver of urban fortification. It's therefore not just a question of simple cause and effect, but it's the whole issue of to understand it through a systemic approach. So it's not just A affecting B, but also in the end through this whole circle, B starting to affecting A. So there's 2 types of interactions and feedback loops. One is reinforcing, so each action adds to the others, make it worse or make it better, and then balancing feedback loops, which is to bring the 2 things into agreement. So when the desired state interacts with the current, it starts to produce a gap until the gap is 0 and the system is stabilized again in terms of reaching the goal. So what does all this mean for the whole issue, the whole thing of security? We can look at urban fortification in this way as well. So therefore, it's to assess the implications for urban sustainability. One has to consider it the causal flow, but also the internal lines of influence, and I'll explain this just now. So it's important, therefore, to look at urban fortification as a complex subsystem of a larger system within the city, and to look at the different multiplicity of feedback loops within the system. So if we then start to look at urban fortification in this way, we see that we start with the desired state, which is safety and security, and people balance this off with how much will it cost them to respond to get this desired state. So how much will it cost in terms of financial terms, but also how much will it cost to the society and the whole structure of society. And then also look at what does regulation and legislation involve. This then produces a gap, and this then leads to the response of fortification and privatization of the space and security. As a result of that, there's a huge change in the nature, the use and the control of the environment, and for a time at least, there's less crime in fortified areas. But that has got a particular cost. It also has a longer term cost, which people often don't take into account as because of the delay. So the longer term cost is things like increased fear, insecurity, spatial segregation, social exclusion, and more division between people as a result of these responses. It also has got some unintended consequences in terms of traffic congestion, noise and air pollution, community conflict, and mistrust. So therefore, we see if this is not too effective, criminals will just change their modus operandi, and they will start to enter enclosed neighborhoods to commit crimes as well. So that's the other side of the story we have to look at. So just to get back to what we were talking about, it is a complex issue, and we have to look at it from many sides. We can't just say that urban fortification is a response to crime and not look at all the rest that influence this. Okay, and then we get feedback loops and balancing loops all between that, but I'm not going to go in detail because I think we are running out of time. So the question then is urban fortification an idealistic idea or a realistic response to crime? First of all, we see that there is a little bit of evidence from studies that it is based on some kind of idealistic ideas. The motivations are influenced by needs and desires of people, and there are 2 sets of design ideas that influence it particularly. The whole idea around creating urban villages or ideal neighborhoods within cities that are safe, that are protected, all the kind of benefits that go with that, and also a link to the whole issue of crime prevention through environmental design, that if you protect your neighborhood through target hardening and other measures, then it will make it safer. So enclosed neighborhoods in that regard becomes an idealistic idea to recreate old suburban neighborhoods of the past, and large security estates is the idealistic idea to create an ideal place or a lifestyle village. But as you've seen, it's also a realistic response. Security remains a main concern in South Africa, so it's a realistic response to a pressing need, even in low-income communities, as we've seen. And very interesting, we've recently completed a big study for the CSIR on medium-density mixed housing in South Africa, and residents from affordable and low-income housing were asked a range of questions, also which things they thought would be critical success factors for the success of that type of housing in South Africa. And out of a whole range of categories, safety and security was the most important. So it's interesting that came up. So even for lower income people, security is very important, and also they often link security to target hardening measures. That's the idea of how a place would be, a housing estate would be more secure. So this is the area that I want to show. The new housing development was actually in that area with semi-detached RDP housing. The beneficiaries for that settlement was taken from the surrounding informal settlements that you can see on the side. But the site was an old caravan park, and it had a wall around, and then after the developers have built this thing, they obviously wanted to encourage integration, and they wanted to break down the wall. And there was a big riot from the community, and they said, no, don't break down the wall. The criminals from next door is going to burgle us. And they actually come from that environment. So it just shows the dilemmas and the fear of crime that happens even in low-income communities. So it then brings us to a number of questions for the future of gating. And we have to reflect on insecurity. We have to then ask, is gating a reflection of insecurity, or is it a desire for an ideal neighborhood? If it is a realistic response, then the question is, who are planners to deny this? Who are we to tell people you're not allowed to make yourself safer? Should it then not be accepted as a working solution? But then what about the uncontrolled growth and the negative impact? Because we know what the implications of that can be over the long term. So it just starts to point out the dilemma that local authorities are facing, this dilemma between the short-term need for safety and security and the longer-term goal of integration and equity that's reflected in all of the planning and development policies in South Africa currently. Okay, so I'm almost finished. Then what I'm arguing is that the only way in which we can start thinking about this in a broader sense and looking at the implications of crime on urban sustainability and the implications of urban fortification for urban sustainability is to look at the city as part of a socio-ecological system. So we see that crime has got a huge impact on the creation of sustainable human settlements, and gated communities is one of the outcomes of that. So we have to start considering things like the cumulative impact of an increasing number of fortified neighborhoods, and I've showed you what the problems can be. Because this is very similar to the whole story around the tragedy of commons that's been argued by Harden, where he says, as each group claims a right to improved living, the collective is gradually eroded. So what is going to happen to the commons or the public realm in the city if more and more privatization of public spaces, services, and security happens in the cities? So therefore, to understand the impact, one has to look at cities as socio-ecological systems. That's just an example of walling in the commons. And what is it to look at cities as a socio-ecological system? Du Plessis argues that it is to look at the city as a complex adaptive system that are integrated across spheres of matter, life, and human social and cultural phenomena, or the mind. That it's structured as nested systems that allows interaction across scale and levels of organization, so that's from the smaller scale up to the bigger scales. And importantly, what differentiates cities from other types of ecosystems is the introduction of abstract thought and symbolic construction. And this allows for considered novelty, communication of ideas across time and space, and therefore, very importantly, to learn and to reflect from what happened in the past. So we can look at it, there's individual actions in the cities, people start robbing houses, That leads to large-scale responses, like gating entire neighborhoods, fortification, people reacting violently in different ways. It leads to then on a city level of the enclosure of whole neighborhoods. It's got an impact on the infrastructure, it's got an impact on pollution. And then finally, a lot of pollution can even lead to impacts for global warming on a large scale if you really take it that far. Also, we see that there's the whole issue of individual and social value systems that you have to consider, that it's got an impact in whether people actually start with these different kinds of actions within the public realm. So this is looking, the one way of looking at the city as a larger socio-ecological system, and just one way in which a small thing like somebody burgling one house can have huge implications on different scales. So in reconsidering the future, there are two possibilities. Firstly, looking at that let's do nothing and then everything will end up in a fortress world, or looking at alternative interventions. So if we go the first route, we see that there's been a publication on future global scenarios, and the negative scenario is that of barbarization, where social, economic and moral underpinnings of the society deteriorate as a result of overwhelming coping capacities of markets and policy reforms. And one of the variants of this is the fortress world, where from protective enclaves, elites safeguard their critical natural resources, and outside these enclaves there's repression, environmental destruction and misery. So that's the worst case scenario. But is there anything else? Oh, this is an illustration of Johannesburg becoming a fortress, Johannesburg. But there are some alternative interventions. So to understanding of cities as a socio-ecological system, one has to look for leverage points in the system to intervene and to prevent the fortress world scenario from occurring. So I'm just going to propose one before I get to my conclusions. So if we start looking at these aspects of the socio-ecological, that we consider, we see we can look at it as complex adaptive systems. So self-organization into collective structures with unpredictable properties to deal with change, that's the issue. So what about self-organizations of communities to address need for safety? That's what urban fortification is all about. So how can we change this into a positive way to start bringing things into the city? These systems are integrated across matter, life and mind. So starting to look at mixed communities behind gates, starting to show people that integration is possible, making them used to that kind of lifestyle, and then hopefully over time it might lead to the breaking down of barriers. And also to look at alternative technologies within, alternative resources, solar power, reservoirs. There's some of the gated communities that are already moving into that regard. To look at nested systems operating across multiple scales, what is the implications for crime prevention, to look at attempts to secure the built environment through, for example, SEPTED, but importantly that these be part of broader crime prevention strategies as well, and it's been mentioned in the previous presentation as well, and to not just to look at crime prevention but also at peace building, and that would also therefore include things like social development and infrastructure development attempts as well. And then finally, abstract thought and symbolic construction, that there's a greater need of humanity and respect from two sides. Okay, so finally, there's a need for a systemic approach. Crime and the fear of crime should not be understood in isolation, because we see that there's many pressures that change the state of the environment, and that's got different implications, and these can have unintended consequences. So we have to consider these dynamic relationships and look at the multiple feedback loops. My last slide. So in terms of the threats to urban security and attempts to address it, we need to understand the whole phenomena of urban fortification as complex adaptive systems, where there's self-organization at community level to adapt to threats, and how can we direct this in a positive sense, to have self-organization but not towards the negative responses. To have integrated systems across matter, life and mind, to have efficient use of resources and integrated inside gated communities, and hope that that will bleed over and start to make the boundaries more permeable. to see it as nested systems allowing interaction across scales and levels of organization, to look at the relationship with the larger systems, to have integrated strategies between different responses to crime, but also between different parts, like how would the security people in the local authority work with the planners, work with the social development people, because in many local municipalities they're not speaking to each other. And they also involve abstract thought and symbolic construction that allows for communication, reflection and learning, so to learn from hindsight, to reflect and adapt and to try and avoid the negative consequences. Thank you.